Passwords can be a pain, but they're the best option we've got, right? That may not actually be the case. This is the Daily Charge. It's Monday, March 9th. I'm Roger Chang, and with me is special guest Stephen Shankland. Now, Stephen, you led our CNET package looking at the future of authentication. What did you find?
Well, the bottom line is that passwords suck. We all know they suck, but they don't just suck for us. They suck for the companies that we're trying to log into, banks, Facebook, Google, whoever. The good news is there's actually a lot of work to fix passwords, to improve the security that passwords use, and to actually replace them altogether. So basically, the computer industry is working its way out of this password hell that we all live in.
Well, so look, passwords, yes, I find them annoying, but they're basically everywhere. They're ubiquitous. Like, how do we get to a point where we can actually fully dump our passwords? What are some of the technologies you encountered?
Sure. So there's a lot of work that is, there are a lot of technologies that are available today, like some single sign-on things you'll see, log in with Google, log in with Apple, log in with Facebook. So those are some early steps. The thing that's potentially more interesting is an alliance called Fido. This is a whole lot of technology companies, including Google and Apple just joined them. And they're working on technology that improves password login and eventually potentially replaces password login. The way that works today, most interestingly, is with these little dongles called hardware security keys. And that really makes it much, much harder for somebody to breach your account, even if they do have your password. And those are the technologies that actually will let us replace our passwords completely later on.
Well, so, and you talked a lot about these security keys. Talk a little bit about how they work and why they're so much more secure than just your simple password.
All right, well, here's the deal. So this is a look at one of these security keys if you want to check it out. It's a little USB thing that plugs into the side of your laptop or into the port on your phone, or it can connect wirelessly. And it's something you have. So when you look at the multi-factor authentication, this is the idea that you're logging with something you know, a password, with something you are, potentially biometrics like your Face ID or fingerprint ID, and then with something you have, like a security key. So when you're combining the two of those three things, you have pretty strong authentication. These little security keys, this is what one looks like right here. These little security keys are, they actually are instrumental in the login process. So they will check the website that you're using so that you can't log into fake websites with your real password. And they really make it a lot harder for a hacker to get into your account.
Now, I've got a MacBook Air, which annoyingly does not have any traditional USB Type A ports. And for a lot of folks, like the idea of carrying around a physical thing, a dongle, to up your authentication, your protection, that's kind of a tough sell. Like, how do you sort of square that with the need for security?
Well, a couple points. First of all, that key I just showed you is a USB-A key. Yeah, that's the old style USB. You can also get ones that plug into USB-C, or on the other end of this one is Lightning for your iPhone.
Okay.
So, and then they also can connect wirelessly with NFC or Bluetooth. So there are other ways that you can connect these keys to your laptop or your phone. But you're absolutely right. This is a hard sell. These things cost anywhere between $20, $70 for high-end models that are fancier. And you'll need at least two because you don't want to lose one or have it stolen and have your account access locked. So yeah, it's a hard sell for a lot of people. But first of all, think of it kind of like your house key or your car key. People are sort of used to that. It's not that much of a stretch for people to think, oh, here's this important thing that I carry with me all the time. So it's not a complete stretch to think that a lot of people might use this. But the other big answer is that newer standards from this Fido Alliance means you can actually use your phone instead of one of these hardware security keys. Your actual phone can register as one of these keys, which means that you don't have to carry anything extra that you're not already carrying with you.
And is that, I know Google is already working or has already worked to put this into Android. Has Apple, which you just said recently joined Fido, have they also done some work with the iPhone as well?
Well, right now, the Apple situation is a little muddy. So if you're logging into a website on an iPhone or an iPad, then this technology works fine as of just a few months ago. That's really very new. But logging with an app is still much better on Android than it is on iOS. We don't have any official word from Apple about when they might improve that access, but my guess is it's on the way since they're a pretty high-ranking member of this FIDO alliance now. So that's a pretty strong signal that they support this technology. So right now it's a little bit better on Android than it is on iPhones, but the trajectory looks good here.
All right, and you wrote a second story, a companion piece about two-factor authentication. This is like the idea that you have, two ways to verify that your identity. And you argue that's not as secure as you might expect. I've been saying for years to folks, like, get two-factor authentication. That's the way to go when it comes to protecting yourself. But you're making me look dumb. So can you break it down? Why isn't it as secure as one might expect?
Okay, so the first thing to say about two-factor authentication is it's still way better than just a password. So it's still a big improvement. Your device is still pretty good. You're not looking dumb.
Not for this, at least. Yes.
But the problem is that it's still not perfect. So if you're using two-factor authentication with codes, there are two ways that usually works. The first is you're getting an SMS code that your bank or somebody sends to you as a text message to your phone. And the second way is with an authenticator app like Google Authenticator. Those technologies can, they help a lot. But the problem is that a hacker can actually intercept those codes. So what happens is the hacker will give you a fake website. You'll enter your username in there, and then you'll get the authentication code. You'll type the authentication code into the fake website. The hacker will then grab that authentication code and type it into the real website. So basically, it's called a man-in-the-middle attack. So basically, the hacker can intercept those codes and use those codes to log in. Another problem is called SIM swapping, where somebody actually gets access to your mobile phone account and therefore can read your SMS messages. So that's what happened to Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter. Mm-hmm. So basically, these login codes are a big improvement, but they're still not as good as these hardware security keys for your important accounts, especially.
Okay, right. So let's poll our live audience. What password security methods do you employ, and do you use any password managers? Do you have any hesitations with using biometrics? What is your current password and social security number? Post in the chat. Stephen and I are here to take all your questions. Well, mostly Stephen, because he's a smart one, and really get a sense of where we are in terms of the state of security. So while you're at your keyboard, go ahead and like, subscribe, share, and ring the bell if you would be so kind. BBG, what do we got in the chat today?
First of all, a disclaimer, I absolutely hate biometrics. I hate them with every fiber of my being. Stephen, what advice do you have for me?
Get over it. Wow. There is an issue with biometrics, which is that you can't revoke the credentials. So if some hacker gets your password, then you can change your password, but you can't change your face. You can't change your fingerprint. You can't change those other biometric aspects. So that's kind of a problem. Usually the way biometrics works these days is your bank or something, they don't actually have your fingerprint on file or your face on file. They rely on local data on your phone or your PC to actually do that authentication and then say, yep, this guy passes the test, so he's good. So it's not maybe as bad a security problem as you might think just because you can't revoke your fingerprints. But mostly biometrics, I think it's here to stay. It's very convenient. It's part of this FIDO Alliance work. It's one of the factors you can use in multi-factor authentication. The bigger issue perhaps is with having Face ID on every street corner and losing the anonymity you have walking around in the city, the privacy. So that's a separate issue from biometric authentication, but obviously it's related.
I'm going to go ahead and extend the poll to the audience that we had previously mentioned. If you have any good suggestions that you think are really great ways to manage your passwords, besides the obvious ones like we're talking about here, technological, I want to know what pneumatic devices you guys use to keep your passwords straight out there. If there are any mental things that you do, any games that you play to try to keep those things, because I do it. Who was talking about it in the chat room here on YouTube? Will says, my passwords are always old, obscure references from movies, spelled differently, partially in leet. For me, I do a very similar thing, but I use music. I use record albums, my favorite albums of all time, that I mishmash into different ways so it all makes sense up here. What have you guys used, Roger and Steven, historically to try to help you down this path?
Yeah, I mean, I learned to use like phrases or like, multi-word phrases, but instead of using those words, I, take the first initial of each word of that phrase, mix it up a little bit. Here at CNET and at CBS Interactive, we change our passwords every, I don't know, several months or so. So
every 3 months.
Yeah, 3 months. So, we've got to constantly change and remember the password that we've changed it to. And so, yeah, that requires a few extra mental leaps to take.
Okay, let me rain on the parade here. You guys are both a bunch of idiots. So
yes. Well, I mean, I knew that already, but thank you for confirming.
Here's the problem. So these systems are good, and if they work for you, that's great. If they work reliably, the big problem is that as you just live your life, you get more and more passwords. So I just counted mine. I have 515 passwords.
Yeah.
I don't see that number going down anytime soon, and there is no way I can remember which of my 515 favorite albums or poems or books or whatever. There's no way I can do that in my own head. So I use a password manager. I recommend other people use password managers. They're not perfect, but they will generate strong, unique passwords for you, and they will remember them for you. So for me, that is the only way out of this password hell. So for people who have a system that works, that's great. We're actually having a couple more pieces we're going to be publishing over the week about password managers and how to pick a good password. So stay tuned later this week for more on for people who do have to use passwords, which is all of us really. But the bottom line is you just can't expect human beings to remember all the passwords. The basic problem is a good, strong password is something that's going to be really easy for a computer to generate, really easy for a computer to memorize, but it's going to be really hard for a human to come up with and hard for a human to remember. So strong passwords and human brains, they don't get along well. That's why I recommend a password manager.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, obviously, that's a big part of the conversation here today. Brian is a big fan of LastPass, says his partner just got his family involved so that they can share stuff like Netflix passwords. What is your favorite password manager out there so far, Stephen?
I've used 3 passwords. I started with LastPass. I went over to Bitwarden, and now I use 1Password. I can't say that I'm deeply in love with any of them. I'm currently using 1Password. I tend to like them technologically. I don't think they do autofill quite as well as LastPass. That is, when you go to a website and it suggests the username and password, which is convenient. I think LastPass is a little bit better at that, but I like the security a little better with 1Password. So I don't think there's a clear winner. I think you can look at Cliff Colby here at CNET has done his review, and he gives the edge to LastPass and 1Password. Yeah. So that's his advice for those particular ones. Get one that works for you, and it'll make your life a lot easier. One of the things I like about 1Password, I went with the family plan over the Christmas holidays. I got my parents onto it. They're worried, what if one of them is incapacitated in some way? I now have, access to their passwords. Now, it's not something you want to grant to everybody, but, maybe for your next of kin, it's something that you want to look into, give your spouse access, things like that. So it can be a good way, not just to manage your password for yourself, but to help your family deal with it.
With a lot of these,
great point.
They have at the very least trial periods, but with the pricing plans, family plans, what is maybe the best kind of budget option for someone out there who's just an average consumer, not power users like yourself or even Roger, somebody who's just out there trying to take care of themselves and their family kind of thing? What's a good budget option for them?
LastPass free works pretty well, and there's a premium option too that adds some extra features. But LastPass free is real, and it's not a crippled version or something like that. Also, I did like Bitwarden, as I say, that's free as well. So you can look around, but both of those 2 options I found were pretty solid at the free tier.
So you are actually advocating the free version of them?
Yeah, I think certainly is a way to get started. I personally believe in paying for software, for services. If it's working for you, delivering real value, then it's not inconceivable that you might want to pay for that, like you pay to go see a movie or you pay for your car or something like that. So to me, free is great, but bear in mind that if you are paying for something, you're supporting a business that might actually be important to you in the long run when it comes to new features, security improvements, things like that. So my personal philosophy is $40 a year is not that unreasonable for something as important as keeping hackers and identity thieves out of your hundreds of accounts.
Touche. Okay, so right before you brought up the dongle, Timothy was asking about physical key fobs. Are they more secure? I'm finding it interesting that. Would you say that we've kind of gone backwards in technology, seeing that we were including more like the physical fob, the dongle in there to try to protect us, or is this just always been the better way?
There is a reason you saw these RSA secure ID tokens for a few decades now, that these little things you'd put on your keychain, it would have the pretty little 6-digit code on an LCD. Those days are long gone, and those definitely were more secure than just passwords. There's a reason that a lot of people, government, military, sensitive accounts use those things, but they weren't great. These newer keys are much more convenient. One key works with many accounts. You can have backup keys, so you can have one in your safe deposit box, one in your desk drawer at home, one on your keychain. There are some big improvements. And also, as I say, they protect against phishing, because the key itself actually checks the website or the app you're using it with, and it will not work with the wrong website. So if somebody sends you to Go0GLE instead of the regular google.com, they'll say, sorry, not going there. When Google started using these things, the successful phishing attacks on their tens of thousands of employees went to what number? 0. It went to nothing. So these things are really effective when it comes to security. Yes, it's a problem. As Roger pointed out, a lot of people are not going to want to carry them around. I'm not convinced they're going to become mainstream, but because you can build them into your phone, that's very early technology right now, but I suspect that will catch on widely. And that's going to be the way a lot of people use these things. So I don't think it's a step backwards. It's definitely a step forward in terms of technological strength in protecting your account. The convenience factor, it's not as convenient as just a password alone. But when you talk about, first of all, being able to use it in combination with biometrics, second of all, being able to build it directly into your phone or actually even your laptop as well, I think it'll catch on much more widely.
Very well said. Next up, from Imagine Sagi on YouTube, it says, I'm skeptical of password managers. They say they don't keep our passwords, but how do we 100% know that these password managers do not keep our passwords?
Okay, so that's a good question. These password managers, how do you know 100%? What you have to do is you have to look at the relative risk out there. So password managers are not perfect. You can roll your own. You can keep your own list somehow and completely avoid password managers. There's some password managers you can use that don't have a cloud service, that don't upload passwords to a central service. But for example, 1Password, it's encrypted with your own keys, and they don't have the keys. So at some point you have to trust them. But I think what you have to look at when you're talking about password managers is the relative risk. So they are not perfect. They're complicated. They have whatever, you might not like their philosophy in one way or another, but you have to compare that to the risk of using conventional passwords and conventional password managers. If you are trying to make up your own password, there's a really good chance you're reusing the same password or reusing minor variations of a password that a hacker can figure out. And those are real threats that are operating today on the internet, where there are 555 million passwords that are already known from many data breaches. So there are a lot of people out there who already have passwords. They can use what's called a credential stuffing attack, where they take hundreds, thousands, millions of usernames and passwords, and they just stuff it into as many websites as they can to try to log on. So these are real attacks, and they work at scale. If you're using a password manager and you have strong, unique passwords, you cut a lot of that off. So yes, there are problems with password managers. We're going to get into a little bit of that later this week at CNET, but there are also big problems with not using password managers. So that's really the kind of the equation I look at.
Yeah, it's all about mitigating risk, right? There's no perfect solution, and we can't expect one, but better than just having a simple password.
Okay, next up, I'm kind of curious from this comment that came in from Timothy on YouTube. Sorry, no, it wasn't Timothy. It was. I lost it. I lost it. It was Brian. It was Brian again. Sorry. Wishing about streaming service use code based linking, which got me to thinking, uh, are we going to see more of this kind of authentication security methods come into play in the non-traditional sense? So as opposed to me sitting down, I want to get into my email. Here's a two-factor. Here's biometrics. Here's this or that. Are we going to see more things like, oh, you want to authenticate your YouTube account on your TV? Just look right at your TV. It's going to scan your face, or there's like a fingerprint sensor on the front of the TV. Are we going to see more things like that coming about?
That's a good question. I can't predict exactly where that's going to go. It seems to me a lot of the way the TV industry has gone is to still have pretty dumb TVs and then to have the smarts built into something else like a streaming box or something like that. I've seen a lot of authentication processes where it says, it's obviously it's a horrible pain to type in your username and password with a remote control. I've done it. I hate it. But there are a lot of situations where it says, use your phone to log in, and then you type in a 5-digit number or something like that into the TV. So I think there are ways that basically push that authentication hassle off of the TV and onto something that's more convenient. I think that's much more likely to be the way we go. I think, there are a lot of people who are leery about the idea of everything recognizing their face as they walk everywhere in their house. If that's, I could see definitely some customers being leery about that, especially if they're in some gray zone where they're sharing their Netflix password with their college roommates that they haven't seen in 5 years. People might have some hesitation about that. So I think it's most likely for the near future that we'll be authenticating with some other device, most likely a phone, and then that'll sync up with the TV and get you logged in.
A comment just came through on YouTube from Will, citing basically a horror story. Did anyone hear about the few YouTubers recently whose entire channels got taken over and erased, even though they were using two-factor authentication? That made me wonder, what kind of accountability is there out there if something like a LastPass, for example, if it failed while you were using their service and you encountered digital losses, whether it be well-being, identity, anything like that, what kind of steps are there in place to protect the user on that side?
So yeah, that's a big issue. When you have harder authentication, when you have more secure authentication, then it's harder to claw your way back in if somebody does crack it. But when you look at those horror stories, you also have to compare it to the vastly larger number of actual horror stories where people are just using a password alone. So nothing is perfect. Dual factor authentication is not perfect. I'm sure these little hardware security tokens are not going to be perfect either. So it's all a question of where your comfort level is. So if you're looking for the perfect security, you're never ever going to get that. If you're looking for better security, two-factor authentication helps. Hardware security keys help more, and you can protect a lot of mainstream services: Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Twitter, GitHub, Dropbox. A lot of these guys use hardware security keys now. So if you are looking for perfect, sorry, I'm not going to be able to help you there. If you're looking for better, then two-factor authentication is better than a password alone, and hardware security key is better than that. Now, when it comes to recovering your password, that's a problem, and it's a big expense right now. Recovering your account if you've been hacked, that's difficult, and it gets differently difficult if you have a hardware security key. You have to have some kind of proof, where you're going to be going through some system at Facebook or Google or someplace where you're uploading driver's license ID photos and things like that. That's gradually maturing as that problem becomes more prevalent, more people go through it. And I think it's going to mature. Actually, one of the interesting things the Fido Alliance is working on, that's the outfit that's developed this authentication technology these security keys can use easily. They're actually working on some of this issue so that in principle later, it will be easier to prove you are who you say you are, either for initial registration or for account recovery. So I think that'll mature as that problem spreads. But again, the bottom line here is stronger authentication is better, and it's not going to be perfect. There's still going to be examples of people who get their YouTube histories wiped or get their Twitter accounts taken over or something like that. But the stronger your authentication, the less likely that is to happen.
We've heard a lot from Stephen, but Roger, I'm curious as to what services you employ, what you would vouch for as far as password management, what's worked for you so far, and any nightmares you've experienced.
No nightmares, knock on wood, but LastPass is one I use as well. So I'm not quite, and I would consider these security keys. But yeah, that's something I'd consider, like, especially after reading these articles. That's definitely an option I would be open to for sure.
Gotcha.
I'm gonna throw in one more comment about these security keys because people might not understand this one aspect of them. You don't necessarily have to use them every time you log in. If you're the chief financial officer at a company, yes, maybe every time you open your laptop, you're going to need to plug one of those in because you have access to such extraordinarily sensitive information. But if you're an average person logging into Gmail, Google requires you to use it the first time you log in on a new device. So you get a new phone, a new PC, then you have to plug in the security key when you're logging in for the first time. After that, it's considered you'd only need to use it during sort of step-up moments where you're going to a higher level of some kind of security. So you can see, for example, a bank might require you to use it, like say you're using your bank app on your phone. You might be happy with just Face ID, fingerprint ID when you're logging on to check your balance. But if you want to transfer money, maybe then you have to plug in the security key. So there are going to be a lot of situations where you don't always have to use the security key, only when it's a particularly sensitive moment. Maybe you're changing your password or changing your phone number or something like that. Then they'll say, okay, now please insert your security key. So with Google, you don't have to use it every day. You just have to use it when you're setting up a new browser, a new PC, a new phone.
I wish that they would follow that model here at CBS Interactive, because our login methodology is annoying as hell. Before we let everyone go, this comment from Brian says, I read an article that Lindsey Graham introduced legislation to make end-to-end encryption impractical. Stephen, can you shine any light on that?
Yeah, so I'm not following the legislation right now super closely. That's mostly other reporters. But the basic tension here, there's a lot of law enforcement pressure. The FBI and the administration, some senators don't like the idea that there's some communication that can't be decrypted, and that's end-to-end communication. So there are a lot of services that use that. For example, WhatsApp from Facebook uses end-to-end encryption, and iMessage from Apple uses end-to-end encryption. The law enforcement folks don't like the fact that they can't peek at that. They're used to the old days where you could request a wiretap on somebody's phone. There was no encryption, so as soon as they got that wiretap, they could eavesdrop, and they want that capability with digital communications as well. The problem is literally every security person out there who deals with encryption says you can't put in a mechanism that lets only the government tap your communications. The problem is that if you let the government do that, then you're also, in effect, letting in hackers and identity thieves and criminals and perhaps government surveillance you might not want if you're an activist in China or something like that. So it's a really sticky wicket. I think the most interesting rebuttal to me to the government side is, well, they also have an abundance of new digital tools that they did not have in the old telephone wiretapping days. They have GPS monitors they stick to the bottom of your car. They have social media accounts. They have graphs that they can generate, contact graphs, who contacts whom all the time. So there's a lot of new digital data that law enforcement operators can use these days, even if they don't have access to encrypted communication.
And just for context, this really came to a head back in 2016 when Apple and the FBI sort of butted heads over whether or not to unlock an iPhone. This was an iPhone that belonged to, I believe, the shooter in the San Bernardino shooting. And yes. They almost went to court. They were about to go to court when the FBI miraculously found some other workaround to get into the phone. But that sort of was one of the first big clashes between the tech world and government over whether or not these backdoors should be put in place. And it's still a debate that's going on right now.
It's actually come back to the fore with some legislation. This is what I think the commenter was talking about with Lindsey Graham. It's come back into the fore with legislation involving child pornography, I think. And so all the technology companies, of course, saying, yes, we don't like child pornography. We'll work to try to eliminate it. But they're not going as far as saying, and we'll give you unfettered access to all this communications. The bottom line is when you're using end-to-end encryption, the companies don't have access. It's not something where you can say, hey, Apple, we have a search warrant, decrypt this chat that you got. Apple literally cannot. So it's definitely a big bone of contention between the tech companies and law enforcement.
So many great questions and comments still filtering in, but we are pretty basically out of time. A couple of people in the YouTube chat citing some other password managers like Bitwarden and Mickey, I think it's how it's pronounced, MYKI. There's also discussion about the increased security vulnerability of using cloud-based applications here. But I want to end on this from Michael Brown. How come when I hear a lot of caution and hesitation about privacy and security with tech companies, but you don't really hear about this kind of stuff with banks or retail shops?
Banks and retailers don't like to talk about their security. Clearly, there's a lot of sensitivity when things like there was a giant Target data breach a few years ago that somebody got in, I forget the number, tens of millions of accounts. Those guys don't like talking about their security. They're not as up to speed with security as big tech giants like Facebook and Google, which have to deal with presumably thousands of attacks every day to try to get into their infrastructure. So there's those guys kind of lag, but you have to give some credit to the banks and retailers. They are improving slowly. There also are a lot of fraud detection mechanisms that you don't necessarily see. So if you're logging in with just a username and a password to your bank, you can bet probably if it's a big bank that there's a lot of other stuff going on behind the scenes. They can do some pretty sophisticated analysis of how you're typing, various other behavioral characteristics of the person using a computer, obviously where you are, whether it's a new machine, some things like that. They can raise red flags within their system and lock things down or partially lock things down, make it a little bit harder to do sensitive things like money transfers or connect a new bank to your existing bank. So there's a spectrum of responses these guys can have. But yeah, there's a lot going on right now with privacy and authentication. I think we're very early. There's a lot of improvement that has to happen, both on the convenience and on the security strength side of the equation. So we're not done by a long stretch of the imagination.
All right. Well, thank you, Stephen, for spending time talking about passwords, the future of passwords. We'll be back tomorrow with more, but if you think of any more good questions when we're off, leave us a voicemail at 862-250-5173. And if you want to learn more about today's topics, you can check the links to all today's stories in the description below. The Daily Charge, I'm Roger Chang. Thanks for joining us.